Finally, out of the military, and now ready for college. It's gonna be great. I'm gonna get my history degree. I'm gonna go become a professor.
Utter madness.
On a very foundational level, that what we understand about race and gender in terms of biological differences are completely false, right? That they're a social construct. So there are no biological differences, but we have given social meaning to biological conditions over time for various reasons, primarily, white supremacy.
Donc, les idées de Bakounine, d'une certaine manière, ressemblent beaucoup aux socialistes utopiques qui envisageaient une société parfaite.
So, in a lot of ways, Bakunin's ideas resemble the ideas of utopian socialism. He imagined this perfect society.
Et donc, où est-ce qu'on envisage à quoi ça va ressembler, mais on ne garde pas la situation maintenant puis essayer de faire des ponts, faire des liens.
So yeah, it envisions a future perfect society, but it doesn't look at society nowadays, and it doesn't build a bridge between today and that perfect society.
Hey! This is library.
I can't have a hairstyle because of your culture? Why?
Because it's my culture. Do you know what box means?
Do you know it was in Egyptian culture? Are you Egyptian? Nah, Brad, you're not.
Are you Egyptian?
No, but it doesn't matter.
Wait, where's Egypt? Tell me.
You know what, girl?
Where's Egypt?
Dude, go. You have no right to tell me what I can read.
Basically, it's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex. And I'm a historian of medicine. I can unpack that for you at great length if you want, but in the interest of time, I won't. So that's a very popular misconception. So essentially, when in my transgender studies classes, what we're doing is looking at actual research and identifying ways that current social issues related to trans people or things that are associated with trans, such as free speech arguments and claims, how that connects to the way that people are thinking, the way that research has been framed, the histories.
Give us some of the other pronouns.
These sort of courses and these sort of ideologies are thriving in universities, and it's really disconcerting to someone who has children. And they're going to be exposed to these ideas. Wow,
I think
a guy who used to teach at Harvard just says send him to trade school.
I think the universities, I think you can make a reasonable case that the universities do more harm than good now. I hate to say that.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
If the traditional purpose of the university is to form an individual's intellect and character based on virtue and reasoning, then the effect that the postmodern phenomena has had on the American university has become detrimental to this purpose. From dissecting early postmodernism skepticism of truth claims as being a construct used to advance a privileged section of the population, one can follow how postmodern theory mutated to break from the perpetual nihilism that came from a hypercritical analysis of meta-narratives to how this has evolved into current critical theory and has begun to reject Enlightenment virtues of reason for being just a methodology of the oppressor. This research is to understand how this has become detrimental to the goal of advancing our understanding of truth by asserting the objectivity of reason, the ability to challenge dogma, and the sovereignty of the individual that is a product of post-Enlightenment liberalism. Understanding the philosophical breadcrumbs through the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st, one will be able to recognize the destructive element that postmodernism has had on the rejection of reason for theory. To see its effects, it is important to work with a more specific definition of postmodernism. In his book, The Postmodern Condition, the postmodern theorist Jean-Francois writes his definition and incredulity of meta-narratives. The term meta-narratives that he refers to here is an all-encompassing structure of interpretation of events to provide meaning for people's lives. These meta-narratives could be traditional religious beliefs like original sin or karma, and in other secular philosophies such as Marxism's meta-narrative of class struggle. Skepticism of certain meta-narratives was nothing new by the time and was often the cause of many advancements in science and philosophy. But this critique of meta-narrative itself was new and would go on to be the bedrock of postmodernism. This is the first hint of detrimental impact of the philosophy, as the destruction of meta-narratives as all equally wrong means that one can fall into an endless spiral of relativity. The relativity of knowing is also a major tenet of postmodernism, as it is a byproduct of rejecting meta-narrative. Since nothing is meta-true, then truth itself is simply a social construction to form people's own local realities that serve a particular purpose for its own sake. Lyotard and his theorists at the time were often by using the construction of language as an example. For instance, a popular example of language to build social constructs is the heap of sand analogy. Since in English, a heap can mean different quantity to different people, and so if one person sees a heap of sand and one by one removes a single grain, then what would that heap not be considered so? Because of these examples of our limitations of truth, the postmodernist sees this as an example of the culturally constructed truth that is subject to the same artificiality of value as any other. This is known as cultural constructivism. Also known as cultural structuralism, it does not try to deny basic reality like rain comes from water and clouds, but that people decide that it is true, that rain comes from clouds is a construction of our perceived limited knowledge, and if someone lived in an ancient society that believed rain came from human sacrifice, then it was just as quote-unquote true as the context of someone's local reality. This constant dismantling of truth claims as just tools of power that are equally subjective meant that for the postmodern theory to become actionable and not fall into a perpetual state of nihilism, then it had to mutate into, ironically itself, a workable meta-narrative by using some of the core tenets of the early theorists and apply this to new workable theories. As the writer Helen Pluckrose and mathematician James Lindsay write in their book Cynical Theories, the highly destructive postmodern theory of the 1960s had mutated into what they called applied postmodernism by the late 1980s. New theories on social justice emerged from this time based on the core of what can be called the first generation of postmodernism. Truth is just a series of language games used to protect the status of privileged class. Today's critical theory had evolved from this core belief by taking language and power and applying this to their own meta-narrative of social change around fixing injustice and privilege by deconstructing the social engineering of knowledge built by the perceived power class that perpetuated itself by oppressing different cultural constructs of knowledge based on one's group identity. Understanding how this evolution of radical skepticism of early theorists occurred, it is best to look back on the foundation of truth and belief as it is faced to new radical doubt that came from the Enlightenment movement of early modern Europe. Rene Descartes' statement, "I think, therefore I am," had become the shield and sword of rationality as it was faced with radical new doubt from the dismantling of earlier religious dogma. Centuries later, faced with more powerful skepticism of truth, theorists inspired by postmodernists wishing to correct its more deconstructive elements would take Descartes' observation that thinking meant itself existence, and if something created from existence means that the proof of its existence, then suffering at the hands of the oppressor meant that not only is the suffering itself real, but that the cause of the suffering must exist as well. By holding on to the belief that identity and its experience of people in the identity is what creates reality, new critical theory was able to become prominent, and with that, new scholarship was born. With critical theory came the new fields of scholarship such as gender studies, racial and ethnic studies, and post-colonial theory that take applied postmodernist discipline of hypercritical discourse analysis and apply this to new narrative of knowledge used to perpetuate whichever identity group occupies a position of power. Identity became paramount to one's applied knowledge, and with that, critical interpretation of the sciences and humanities as just forms to oppress others, and by critical examining and dismantling these tools of the oppressor, can people make a better world. Those who claim that identity can relate to one's own reality is not completely without its own merit. In her 2007 book, Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing, Oxford University professor of philosophy Miranda points to how our identity can play a part in our perceived lack of knowledge, often from forms of prejudice like racism or sexism. However, where her book finds the issue with critical theory applied to identity-driven conception of knowledge is that it forces one to be part of the group and therefore not taking into consideration an individual's experiential knowledge. This is the first major effect that the postmodern influence critical theory has inflicted in Western academia. Because as previously mentioned, if one's conception of truth comes from one's identity in relation to the power dynamic between other identity groups, then the individual's experiential knowledge must be that of the affiliation with that individual's identity group. If being part of a particular identity means that you share the same knowledge as everyone else within that community, then one loses their individuality and in so their own experiential knowledge. In this book by Syracuse University professor of philosophy of education Barbara Applebaum, Being White and Being Good, the author suggests that all her students who are white are complicit in systemic racism simply due to their skin color. From her analysis, white students have learned from the development of powerful discourses as she refers to the postmodern theorist Michel Foucault's observation of power works through discourse to constituent subjects. This view has the negative effect on what the liberal principle that has led to further equality throughout the system of education. when seeing people as individuals and therefore more in common to the individual observer, leads those to be empathetic to the cause of equality as a means of separating one's prejudices attributed to that group. However, along with critical theory's effects on identity-based epistemology, there has also been the challenge to empirical science and academia that threatens the credibility of the university. With the system of knowing of the physical world through testing and applying the results into workable knowledge, science as a methodology became criticized by early postmodern theorists for its universality and monopoly on truth claims as artificial paradigms. Borrowing from Thomas Kuhn's observation of scientific revolutions that are linked to political upheaval in a society that changed the entire understanding of perceived truths. An example of this is Galileo's defense of the Copernican model of the solar system. It did not only change the young discipline of astronomy, but also changed the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. Remembering that truth is simply a relative to the observer's perspective, according to Foucault and Lyotard, then relative truth that the sun revolved around the earth was just as true as the Copernican model. Viewing science in this way can negate the purpose of science as a means of finding truth of the physical universe that can be applied by everyone, not just the culture that discovered it. But as critical theorists have applied this postmodernist view of sciences, it has become challenged within academia. The Rutledge Handbook of Epistemic Injustice is an example of the skepticism of science within critical theory, as the handbook uses examples of when scientific truths were used to justify colonialism and chattel slavery, yet it omits that it was the process of the scientific method that was able to thoroughly debunk concepts like social Darwinism. Nevertheless, the influence that postmodernism has had on current critical theorists and their brand of social justice has caused new debates among the sciences on the method's validity. Constructionist models of inequity, for example, means that some form of oppression must be present, as the handbook later goes on to say, formal and informal barriers to the participation of women and racial minorities as scientific enterprises have had the effect of disproportionately favoring white males' presence and influence in science. Regardless of the actual barriers that have and possibly still exist, and previously mentioned importance of identity, means that for science to promote the betterment of all mankind, then according to theory, women and racial minorities in the United States should be promoted into the sciences simply of the virtue of their identity, not their merit. This is detriment to the earlier stated cause of making science universal. Of course, women may have had a better understanding of other women's bodies as a physician, but if compared to a male counterpart with more experience in the field, then he would still be preferred physician, not due to her gender, but by her merit. Regardless of the issues attacking our understanding of knowing, the reason that the matter in this ability to challenge theory and allow for the free exchange of ideas that gave critical theorists the right to challenge the dogma of the university. Borrowing again from Applebaum's book, the prospect that one cannot disagree with theory is quite prevalent. The Foucauldian concept of dominant discourses that influence Applebaum's observation are on display when she states, even if one retreats to the position where only one speaks for oneself, one's speech is still not neutral and still reinforces the continuance of the dominant discourses by omission. The very act of openly disagreeing with theory, according to educators like Applebaum, who borrows from the postmodern knowledge principle of truth being constructs of language, means by disagreeing, one allows for powerful discourses to be heard. She later states, one can disagree and remain engaged in the material, for example, by asking questions and searching for clarification and understanding. Denials, however, function as a way to distance oneself from the material and to dismiss without engagement. So one can disagree with her if they are not understanding the material, but denial of its credibility outright will be dismissed as she assumes her thesis to be true. Critical theorists have now also taken on a pseudo-religious dogma like lecturer Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, where she argues that all white people are implicit in racism and cannot escape from their bias. The parallels to original sin and sanctification are pronounced, and just like dogmatic defenses of faith, attacks on theory lead to an excommunication. In the modern university, this excommunication means losing their tenure or even in their careers. One of the most extreme cases was the Washington State College of Evergreen in 2017. After a call for a day of absence in which white students and faculty were encouraged not to attend the college, biology professor Brett Weinstein challenged this in an email saying, on a college campus, one's right to speak or to be must never be based on skin color. Since this was seen as a threat, according to student activists, they proceeded to disrupt his classes, make verbal and physical threats, and all while the college president told the campus police to stand down.
Days following the protests, students demanded the administration fire the professor and tackle what they call years of institutional racism. They barricaded campus spaces, wrangled with campus police, and stormed the president's office.
It's not an accident that all of our administration is white. Right. It's not an accident.
Regardless of how one feels about the issue of identity and representation on campus, the use of force and intimidation in a coordinated effort like this proves now more than ever what the solution to these issues is in the university. Unlike Vedas, what happens in the university does not always stay in the university. What the institution instructs is what graduates bring into the quote-unquote real world. In the article from Evaluation Assessment, Evaluation, and Accountability, the author suggests that good education is from better understanding what the graduate leaves with, rather than purely relying on metrics that apply to everyone. If this is the case, then closing one's minds to dogmatic theories of the world does a disservice to students. Without the ability to feel safe and respectfully challenging ideas, then the students are not able to possibly grow and adapt their worldviews and become authors of their own lives. The students who wish to be given an opportunity to disagree and are being denied will become resentful and breed radical polarization within the student body. Borrowing from John Stuart Mill, the ability to challenge assumptions can have two effects. One, strengthens one's convictions by refuting challenges to them, and two, adapting or outright dismissing one's convictions when presented with better alternatives. In his 1859 essay On Liberty, Mill uses the example of Newtonian physics to drive this point. If given the overwhelming evidence for Newton's laws, universities see fit to censor any opposition to it, would it not then breed distrust and motivation for alternatives that are lacking? Because why else would one have to rely on force to silence opposition if the Newtonians believed truth was on their side? This is why my introduction stated that the purpose of the education is to build one's intellect and character based on virtue and reasoning. The university as an institution has evolved to become the incubator for advancing liberal ideals. And just as it is under attack from radical critical theorists, the solution to the problem is to remember why liberty matters, and that the right to freely challenge does not prove one is right, but rather the opportunity to prove someone is right. Seeing how the American university has gotten to a point that its reputation, integrity, and purpose are at risk from a destructive philosophy made actionable in a culturally shifting society, one can see the breadcrumbs leading back to a circle of 1960s French wannabe intellectuals to explain the current state of critical theorists in academia. By continuing to resist the influence that critical theories has had on the university, it is possible to return to the purpose of the university, not purely for preparing some kind of employment, but to build character and protect classical liberal virtues of individualism and free expression. Well, that was a whole bunch of word salad. I think I'm just going to talk about history from now on. Thanks for watching.
Now ain't I right? Ain't you right? Ain't you right? It matters not to you how people suffer, and should they, you consider that a gain. You bring a lot of trouble to the town and then you leave. That's part of your communistic game. I detect a little communism